to.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Antonucci, a New Hampshire Peace Action board member, and I'm glad to welcome you to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online on July 31st, 2023. Yeah, that sounded right. Quick reminder about Zoom. We love it when you keep your video on, although we understand if you don't want to. But we do ask that you keep your audio muted, at least for now, and use chat to ask questions. Later on, there'll be time for unmuting for questions. But okay, quickly, let me tell you that for over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all. In that spirit of respect, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge that we are doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and the people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. So tonight, our ongoing Monday night series continues with Hassan El-Tayyab, the Friends Committee on National Legislation's Legislative Director for Middle East Policy. He is going to give us an update on, and then we're going to discuss the status of the Saudi-led war in Yemen. This has been an issue that Peace Action has been working on for quite a few years. But things have been changing. And so we're really interested to have him and figure out what's going on and what we can do about it. He'll speak first, and then we'll move to Q&A. Of course, you can start using the chat for your questions when they occur to you. And then later on, we'll also have a time when you can raise your virtual hand and ask questions. But for now, please join me in welcoming Hassan.
Thank you so much, Amy and Will and New Hampshire Peace Action. I got up to New Hampshire last week. I had a fantastic time at the World Fellowship Center, talking with peace activists around New England, a part of the Peace Action Network. Love you all, love what you do. It's so important to the peace movement, and you're in such a critical state, for so many foreign policy issues. And you've been engaged on Yemen for years and years. So I'm just so grateful in debt to you, and look forward to diving into this conversation. Before we give an update on what's going on right now, we just want to set the table with what brought us to this moment in time. How did this war begin? For many of you, this might be repeat information, but I will try to go through an intro so folks here are all up to speed. Yemen's political instability began after a 2011 Arab Spring uprising that ousted President Saleh, who had been in power since 1990. Then Vice President Hadi became Yemen's interim president for what was supposed to be a 2-year term in office during a transition to a more representative form of government with regular elections. In 2014, Yemeni frustration with corruption, rising fuel prices, unrest across Yemen, including calls for an independent southern Yemen. Taking advantage of that situation, the Houthis, aka Ansar Allah, a politically armed movement that originated from the Houthi tribe, entered Sana'a in September with the assistance of the ex-president Saleh and put Hadi under house arrest. And in 2015, with the stated goal of restoring Hadi to power, Saudi joined forces with the UAE and formed a coalition that we now call the Saudi-led coalition. And they were backed with robust military support and weapon sales by the US, by the United Kingdom, France, Canada. And the Saudis framed this in sectarian terms, insisting that Iran was supporting the Houthis and they had to stop the threat of this Shia-backed militia group. There's a lot of reasons why people think the Saudis, waged this war. They've been backing Hadi. They were alarmed by the Houthis at their southern border, and they were worried about the Bab el-Mandeb Strait off the coast of Yemen, which is a critical oil shipping lane. It facilitates the route of millions of barrels of oil per day, as many of you know, and this is just a key supply line. This is maybe less commonly thought of, but then Saudi Defense Minister Mohammed bin Salman, who he used this conflict to consolidate national power, and actually has now, passed both, brothers and cousins and others who are in line for the throne. He superseded them and is now the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. And if nothing changes, he will inherit the throne. So the U.S. role, as I explained in this conflict, we've been providing weapon sales under the Obama administration. We kept supporting it under Trump, and there's still a level of U.S. complicity even now today under the Biden administration. This backing included targeting assistance, logistical support for coalition airstrikes, mid-air refueling for Saudi warplanes, spare parts transfers, and $54+ billion in military support. This is not just the Saudi war in Yemen. This is the U.S. Saudi war in Yemen, and that's how a lot of Yemenis describe this situation. So that's probably a good place to leave, like, kind of the intro there. Congress did a lot under the Trump administration in particular. The Saudi warplanes were doing these indiscriminate attacks on Yemen. They were attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, like hospitals, schools, roads, bridges. They attacked telecommunications centers. They attacked water and sewage treatment plants, which are why we have so much of the disease we have today, tragically. And also, these ports of entry. The Sana'a airport had been attacked several times, which is a lifeline for humanitarian aid and civilian traffic. So, really tragic war. We've got, right now the World Food Program says this year, 19 million Yemenis are suffering, from food insecurity. We've had millions of cases of cholera as a result of the attacks on the attacks by the Saudi-led coalition on these sewage treatment plants. There are no clean hands in Yemen. The Houthis have conducted, horrific attacks against, civilians, obstructed humanitarian aid. You've got the United Arab Emirates occupying parts of the country. You've got the Southern Transitional Council and, other actors in Yemen. And we haven't even talked about Al-Qaeda. So this is really a tragic situation in terms of human toll. But okay, enough of that. What can we do about this? So in 2018 and then going on 2019, Congress really made history, and your senators actually voted in favor of this resolution, the War Powers Resolution, to terminate U.S. military support for this war. That was narrowly focused at the mid-air refueling piece of what I discussed earlier. Which did help Saudi Arabia conduct tens of thousands of airstrikes. And for the first time in 50 years since the War Powers Act of 1973 passed over a Nixon veto override, over a Nixon veto to override that. We hadn't seen Congress pass this type of resolution. So it's absolutely historic. Right after that happened, actually right before it happened, Trump said, well, you can't make me end mid-air refueling. I'm going to do it anyway. And in November, he actually stopped mid-air refueling. Congress proceeded to pass it, through the Senate. And what we saw after that was a Hodeidah ceasefire. This is Yemen's largest Red Sea port, where millions of Yemenis are relying on this humanitarian aid. We saw a reduction in cross-border attacks by both sides. We saw the UAE start to withdraw militarily, not completely, but really started to pull away from this war because Congress And the American people, really pressing their members of Congress, said this is absolutely untenable and we don't want to be involved anymore. And it had a real impact on diplomacy. So thank you all for, I know so many people here worked on that resolution in 2019. So flash forward, a whole bunch of stuff happened right at the end of Trump's time in office. He put this terrorist organization designation on Ansarallah, aka the Houthis. Trump came into office. President Biden came into office, removed the FTO designation, and then said he was going to end support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen. So now we're getting a little closer to what's happening right now. Unfortunately, offensive operations was never clearly defined. The State Department in the GAO report, it revealed that actually they don't really have a definition of what's offensive and what's defensive. So, and then in that first year, President Biden proceeded to sell about $1 billion of weapons to the Saudi-led coalition as they were, indiscriminately bombing Yemen. Sana'a Airport was bombed several times in his first year in office. And so really, even though that there was some progress, largely the U.S. was still militarily supporting the war, mainly in the form of logistics and spare parts and maintenance. And these are essential to, put new tires on these F-16s and just service these planes and make sure that they can keep flying. So fast forward, January 2022, we saw some of the biggest escalations of the war. And then Congress started to say, okay, it's time to dust off that old war powers resolution. And that's kind of what we did. We saw, right around that time during Ramadan, which is in April of 2022, the warring parties agreed to a truce. They actually said, we're going to stop, cross-border attacks. So Saudi, they stopped their airstrikes. The Houthis said they're going to stop their cross-border attacks as well into the UAE and Riyadh and Saudi Arabia. And, why, there's lots of reasons, potentially we could look at for why this all happened. I think the congressional pressure, our work as peace activists were huge in this. It's never that simple, though. I think the Houthis, developed their technologies to be able to strike also deeper into the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that was an incentive, I think, for Saudi Arabia, who was trying to pivot away from the war in Yemen and actually focus on their Vision 2030, which is this large economic plan that they have for the country to really bolster its growth and to kind of move away from just being dependent on oil for revenue. So we had some big changes. They also, at that same time, opened up the airport. They started allowing several flights from Sana'a Airport to Amman, Jordan, every week. So that was a significant change as well. So Yemenis could finally, have commercial, exits from the country and be able to see friends and family and relatives and be able to leave for critical medical care. Obviously a country of 30 million people, a couple flights a week, it's not really enough to address humanitarian and human needs, but again, we're on the right trajectory. So, there were lots of skirmishes that happened on the ground, but largely like the structure of it stayed in place. And we saw, still humanitarian suffering because of the ports being blockaded and the obstruction and different conflicts on the ground, but it didn't escalate into this wider proxy war in the same way it had been. So I chart that as some success. And again, big shout out to all the peace activists around the country that worked on this. In October 2022, we saw the truce actually kind of collapse. Like there was no formal structure. They couldn't agree on the deal. There's some outstanding issues. The ports in particular are one of them. Who's going to get the money from goods entering into Yemen? The Yemeni government wanted civil servants to be paid with that money. The Houthis wanted some of that money to go to their security forces. And so there was some conflict around that. Where are we going to open up the airport? Really, how is this peace going to look? So that's been very challenging. We saw really, this has been kind of the turning point. And now we're getting very close to what's going on right now. China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran that not a lot of folks in the United States were aware of or quite knew about. People watching closely, have been seeing the fact that, Iraq and Oman have been hosting peace talks between Saudi and Iran for a couple years. But I think a lot of folks were caught off guard when they saw China actually host the talks in Beijing, and they signed the deal right there. It wasn't like a full rapprochement, but it was a normalization agreement that was quite significant. And so that set off a whole bunch of things in motion, and really positive things. We saw, sorry, just grabbing my notes here. Okay. We saw a prisoner exchange. 900 prisoners were exchanged, including some of Hadi's relatives. So these are top level folks. This is a high level prisoner exchange. We also saw the restrictions on Aden port, which is Yemen's southern port, really get lifted. So that's 500 items on this no import list. That's batteries, fertilizer, solar panels, things like that. So that was lifted. There are these extra security clearances, that had to happen in Jeddah. And so now boats can go right into southern Yemen and supposedly, get in. Why they had all these restrictions on its Yemen's southern port, which they technically controlled, is kind of baffling to a lot of folks. But hey, it's the Saudi-led coalition. This is what we signed up for. And now Hodeidah port, they said that they would lift some restrictions, including like not keeping ships in this coalition holding area. And eventually they moved to expand flights to about 6 per week to Jordan, and they open up flights into Saudi Arabia for Hajj, or this Mecca pilgrimage. So some progress, right? Okay, now now this is where things get a little bit murky, and bear with me here. So after all of this happened, we have this kind of this amazing flurry of activity. I literally have a blog that I wrote in advance because I was trying to be ahead of the news. You know how I do. I'm trying to get that written because I thought we were going to be extending this truce for another 6 months. I swear to God, I thought we were right there. And unfortunately, while there have been some positive signs, things have really stalled out. They were supposed to come back to the peace table after they came, after the Ramadan, after that Eid celebration was done. They were supposed to come back and really, bang out a longer term deal. There are still negotiations going on. They just agreed to, allow the UN to kind of offload a lot of fuel from the Safar oil tanker. So that's ongoing. So that's diplomatic progress. But the US government really started pushing some pessimism. They flipped these bilateral talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis over to the UN. And since that happened, things have kind of stalled. Here's a couple quotes I think that are worth mentioning. And I just saw a new one in the media just this past week here. Okay, despite all this progress, we've got Tim Lender-King, the U.S. envoy for Yemen, pushing really pessimistic comments. I don't expect a durable peace or durable resolution, and we should not, to the nearly 8-year conflict in Yemen happen overnight. A political process will take time and likely face numerous setbacks, but I continue to be optimistic that we've got a real opportunity. Roughly speaking, I might have, truncated a bit. He also said, I don't think we're near the finish line yet. There are great challenges ahead. I think there's a considerable amount of distrust. On its face, it seems right, but when we've got like massive progress, this is kind of strange comments to be saying right at that same time. I think it's also notable that Brett McGurk, the guy at the National Security Council, also went over to Saudi Arabia, and it seemed like there was a discussion about regional security, protecting Saudi from threats emanating from Yemen. You know how the story goes. It seems like the U.S. is then, again, I don't have like a clear sense of exactly why. I'm not in those rooms at this point, unfortunately. But it seems like there was a lot of fear in the U.S. government about China getting too close to Saudi Arabia and them wanting to slow things down and really stop these bilateral talks. Their ultimate goal is to broker an Israel-Saudi deal. So we got to keep an eye on this Abraham Accords 2.0. And it's having this, negative effect, unfortunately, in Yemen. And, often what we've heard is that, we need, we can't have a Saudi Houthi deal because we need an inclusive peace, and that includes all Yemenis to the table. And I totally want to get there, so I'm not opposed to inclusive peace, but we shouldn't be dictating the terms. That's what I'm opposed to, is that the U.S. Somehow is not letting Yemenis, which the Houthis and the 80% of the population that live under Houthi control, those are Yemenis. And if they want to broker a deal with Saudi Arabia to stop airstrikes and lift port restrictions, I think they should be able to do that. There's a lot of questions about, so Hadi was deposed, around the time of that original Ramadan ceasefire in April last year. And then they installed a group of 8 guys backed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE called the Presidential Leadership Council. So when you hear people talk about the legitimate government or the internationally recognized government of Yemen, it's starting to get a bit farcical, especially to Yemenis that I've spoken with, that this government can't even control Aden and really doesn't have an ability to protect Yemeni civilians. In fact, Aden and the south are becoming some of the more unstable areas of Yemen right now. And a lot of people, internally displaced populations, have actually moved from the south to the north, where they think it's more stable and there's a more vibrant economy. So there's a lot there. I've got a lot of questions for the administration, and I'm trying to get answered. What's on this list of items that's restricted at Hodeidah Port? Maybe you all could help us answer some of these questions. I think Senator Shaheen would be, a perfect person to ask this of the administration. We'd like to know a justification for all these items at Hodeidah Port. I've heard that batteries are on the list. I've heard that fertilizer. I've heard that solar panels are on the list. Yemen's in an energy and food crisis. So, these could be really helpful items for people. Also, what are the diplomatic barriers to opening up more flights to more destinations? There was an incredible article. I don't know if someone can share it in the chat, but it was in The Nation last week, and it covered a heartbreaking, really just a tragic story of an 11-year-old Yemeni girl who has, tumor-like, cancerous cells on her arm, and it's causing her immense pain. She needs to get to Mumbai for treatment every 6 months. They haven't been able to leave since 2018. Yes, the flights are opened up, but they can't afford it. And the Sana government says that 90% of Yemenis are in that boat where, yes, the flights are open, but they can't afford it. So what we're trying to do is get more flights to more destinations and reduce the cost, and also let people go directly where they want to go. People aren't going to, I'm Jordanian. Apparently, these Yemenis don't want to go to Jordan to get medical treatment. They want to go to Mumbai where it's a little cheaper. Okay. Also, did the U.S. offer any weapons sales since the truce began, even since the China brokered Saudi-Iran deal? Why is Tim Lenderking pushing pessimism on negotiations when diplomatic progress between the warring parties was moving so quickly? We don't really understand that. And and definitely, there's a lot of unanswered questions here, and we're trying to get to the bottom of this at Friends Committee on National Legislation. And I really I think any of that would be great. I'm hoping that we get a briefing, that some of our core members of Congress get a briefing on this. I'll say, just pointing to a couple things that are proactively being done by members. One, we saw Tlaib lead some Rashida Tlaib from Michigan lead some incredible letters in the past year. One was to increase humanitarian funding to pay our fair share, which they're asking for at least 1.2 billion, and directed towards civil society and not giving it to huge INGOs. But actually giving it to Yemenis so that they can chart their own future and get long-term livelihoods. Love that. The second letter she led with Rep. Khanna was another, about 40 members or so signed it, basically asking four things to the Biden administration. One, while these talks are going on, no more military aid for the Saudi war in Yemen, no more weapon sales. Two, let's lift these restrictions on movement and access. The Yemeni people, their lives are not a bargaining chip. They should be able to leave Yemen. This is not right. They should be able to import goods. They should be able to get medicine into the country. So let's lift that blockade. Number three, we want Saudi Arabia and the UAE to end their occupation of Yemen. Right now, the UAE has troops and a military base in Socotra Island. The Saudis, they've got troops occupying in Al Mahra, and that's an eastern province in Yemen. And it's critical for Yemen to be a country. You got to end the occupation. That also applies to in the West Bank and ending that occupation. So these things can linger on a long, long time, and so that's why we're working to try to end that occupation of Yemen as soon as we can. And obviously, last but not least, robust humanitarian funding, reconstruction efforts. I was grateful to see that the UK, I believe, contributed another 200 million in the past week for humanitarian aid. That's fantastic. Yemen's going to need billions to actually rebuild, and if and when this war ends. So we really need to make sure that, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which has caused so much of the devastation, but also the United States and all these other countries that have been supporting the war effort, really contribute. So just a couple other things on congressional action. This National Defense Authorization Act gave me a little bit of hope that people are still engaged. One key provision on the House side was by Rep. Val Hoyle. She's a freshman Democrat, but she took over for Rep. DeFazio after he retired. He gave a long service to our country, and we owe him our gratitude. He was also our Yemen champion on the War Powers resolution last year. So we really appreciate his leadership, and we're glad that Rep. Val Hoyle has stepped into that role to be a new Yemen champion on the House side. She led a provision to cut off all funding for more offensive operations. This includes spare parts, maintenance, intelligence sharing, etc. That was supported by Rep. Mace, a Republican from South Carolina. We got Rep. Liu, House Foreign Affairs Democrat, Rep. Adam Schiff, someone that's really been, a true leader on the Democratic Party around so many things, including press freedoms. So we're glad to have his support. Rep. Khanna, Rep. Jayapal, Rep. Tlaib also got on the bill. So feeling very good about that. There were that provision got stripped. There were a couple other great provisions by Dingell and Ted Lieu that got stripped too. On the Senate side, this is actually interesting and actionable for all of us right now. There was a provision to keep to extend the mid-air refueling ban on Saudi warplanes. So that's in the Senate NDAA, and we got to keep that into the final bill. That's another thing that I'm working on. Actually, earlier today, I was drafting a coalition letter to the chairs and ranking members of the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. While it's not everything we need, keeping the pressure on, making sure that we're incentivizing folks to, stay at the negotiating table and off the battlefield, I think is absolutely critical. We're continuing to support these other provisions. I think for the grassroots, really kind of engaging our members and like working with our senators and our reps to really ask the administration for an update, like what's going on with this war in Yemen. Can you answer some of the questions that I shared? And I'm hoping that soon, maybe in September, that we'll get a vehicle in. I don't know if there's an appetite right now with the truce negotiations to do a war powers resolution again. I think a lot of members of Congress feel like, well, the bombs aren't falling. It seems like there's progress on the truce. I think it would be beneficial to have some legislation to organize around to prohibit funding for more airstrikes, very similar to what Rep. Val Hoyle has introduced, whether it's the form of a joint resolution or a war powers resolution. FCNL is hoping to support legislation that really stops more military aid for the Saudi war effort. So I could say a lot more. I am so grateful for the absolute, just incredible dedication and passion from New Hampshire Peace Action. I've spoken to your group and for so many years on this issue. You've been so engaged, doing lobby visits, and just know we are not alone. There are activists around the country. In December alone, when Bernie Sanders brought his Yemen war powers resolution to the floor, endorsed by 100 national organizations, co-sponsored by 130 members in the House and Senate, bipartisan, bicameral. We got 100,000 people to call Congress or email Congress in December in like 2 weeks. There was lots of activism going around, and it's being led by incredible Yemeni activists that really were taking our lead from, like Aisha Juman, like Shireen Al-Ademi, like Jahan Hakim, like Iman Saleh, who actually went to the Capitol and did a hunger strike in front of Congress and the White House, and said, "Hey, I'm going to be here until we lift this blockade." And just people like that just are so inspiring, and it's making a difference. I mean, granted, we haven't concluded the war. I told you about a lot of issues, but we should take solace and really feel good as a movement that Saudi Arabia hasn't bombed Yemen in over 15 months. I mean, that is absolutely incredible. They've lifted restrictions on movement and access. People can fly out of Yemen for the first time, or fly out of Sana'a airport for the first time in so many years. So with that, I can pass it over to your questions, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much for all that information and that update, Hassan. So folks, the chat is open, and you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. I can definitely jump in with some thoughts, or with some questions. I'm gonna try. A lot of my questions are the same as your questions, so I won't push on those, at least not at first. I would actually love to hear what you think. I do feel like this is a success in terms of activists making a difference. And I'd love to hear if you can make a few more connections, like what did we do right? What can we learn from this? What can we keep doing? So often peace activists feel like we're just fighting these battles we never win. And I have heard some people say, "Oh, well, this is China helped. We never did anything, so we can't take any credit." So could you say a little more about that?
So great question. China helped, but so did we. Okay. So I think a core part of the strategy was, one, listening to Yemenis. We listened to Yemenis. They were saying, we need help getting the US to stop supporting these bombings in our country. And we did something about it. We're like, your struggle is our struggle. We're going to be with you in this fight. And we stuck with it. So that's one. Let's listen to impacted communities, because they're going to tell us what they need. And there are some Yemenis, not all Yemenis are on the same side of this issue, but I think there's with the peace movement, with Yemenis that want to end this US complicity and this military support, there's a lot of common cause. There are other issues that I think we can follow the lead of impacted communities like Israel, Palestine, and so many other places. So that's one. I think the other thing was the vehicle itself. There's a lot of bills that sit there and you don't get a vote on it. This is something that we had a vote as a part of our strategy, and we didn't just force one vote. We forced vote after vote after vote, and that kept Yemen on the agenda for Congress. So rather than just, okay, yeah, well, there's a lot of co-sponsors on that bill. Actually, your boss needs to write a memo on this because he's going to have to vote on it on the House floor or the Senate floor next week. And that's really, I think, something that has resonated in Congress and Capitol Hill, and something that is a key part of the strategy. Let's have a floor plan, right? NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is where we got a ton of those votes. So that's part of it. It doesn't always have to be war powers. You can do things on the NDAA, and just let's be aware, like, okay, June and July, that's when these votes are coming to the floor, right? Is one of our members on the Rules Committee? Can we make sure that vote, that resolution gets a vote? So that stuff like that. The other thing I think was really having a strategy that was inclusive, where we got. I like to, I didn't start my conversation with you all like this, but I often do. What does Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ilhan Omar, the Koch Institute, George Soros, and the Raging Grannies all have in common? Is they all want to end military aid for the war in Yemen, and they want to do it for slightly different reasons. There might be some overlap, but really, progressives, bleeding hearts like myself, we really want to end this humanitarian suffering. Plain and simple, we want to end the civilian suffering. A lot of conservative groups, Constitutional War Authority folks, they actually care about the humanitarian suffering too, no joke. But they also want to limit the U.S. Entrenchment in all these conflicts. They want to make sure that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is being abided by, and that we don't turn into a monarchy, which the framers of our Constitution really tried to reject, and going overseas to seek monsters, and so I think that strategy of like getting conservatives and progressives to work together was fantastic. That really is how we split the other side's majority that they had. So we got that sliver of libertarians, we got the progressives to come together, and then we just ran the train. We stayed with it, and really we were, just working hard at it, and not giving up. And I think by creating these wedge issues, by forcing these votes, we raise the political cost for anyone standing in our way. The Saudi-led coalition, they're like, oh my God, we are constantly getting bombarded by Congress and the media, and the UAE was like, wow, this is really toxic. We want to back off of this thing. And by continuing to churn and burn and getting folks to stay engaged, we made a significant difference that is still being felt, and I know contributed to saving lives. We are not out of the woods. The war in Ukraine, the fact that wheat has skyrocketed in price because of the just the war, and the fact that it's getting more and more expensive to buy wheat around the world, it's creating the even worse situation for the famine in Yemen as well. But there are significant things that we should be proud of, and we have a long way to go, but we should definitely see what we've done as a success. And I think we can replicate this in other areas. And I'm working right now to replicate this on Israel-Palestine, trying to make sure that we get some votes. There's other things besides the War Powers Act, like 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act is another way we can trigger a vote. The Arms Export Control Act, if there's new weapon sales announced, that's another place we can force members to get on the record. And then, once you get people on the record, that's in the history books, people. That is there permanently, and then we can go back to it and say, okay, and then we actually know where people stand on the issue. So sorry if it was a long-winded answer, but I wanted to give it a solid response.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Moji has a hand up, and then I see a question in the chat. Moji, why don't you start? You've had your hand up a while. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much. My camera is not working. Salam.
Peace back at you, brother.
Brother Hassan. I am an Iranian American peace and human rights and democracy and climate change do-gooder activist. And people at New Hampshire Peace Action know me well from Iranian Nonviolence Initiative, as well as the Intersectional Circles Initiative. And the question I have has to do with war is a racket. I'm sure you've heard that almost cliche term. For any conflict to go on, there are a lot of people who develop a codependent relationship, sometimes as enemies, because they are benefiting politically, economically, strategically, so to speak, and financially and geopolitically from the continuation of that conflict. So when a movement is somehow somebody makes a movement or some peace builder forces, try to reduce the temperature of the conflict toward some kind of a resolution of it, there are other people who are supposedly, enemies of each other. They pour fire, or they impede the resolution of a conflict because they're going to be in the cold. So I call that as the interdependent collaboration of, in the context of the global South, of internal despotism and external colonialism needing one another, especially when they need one another as enemy. So how, in the context of the Yemen, I was happy when the regime in Iran, which has an execution order against me, was somehow persuaded by the Chinese to begin building peace with Saudi Arabia. But in order so that the regime can then clamp down on people like me, my counterparts inside Iran, so that they have this dual strategy of flexibility outside while hardening inside.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the people inside Iran who benefit from the state of Cold War in the region, they don't like the conflict with Yemen to come to an end. Therefore, they sabotage it. How do you deal with that dynamic? I know it's a vague question, but how do you deal as peacemakers with the dynamic of the people who pretend to be one another's enemies are actually codependent on one another? Internal despotism and external colonialism need one another, either as friends or as enemies. This is what Dr. Mossadegh of Iran said after the coup in 1953.
Yeah.
Your reflections. Thank you. And thank you for what you're doing, brother.
Oh, thank you, and peace to you. And I can't even imagine what it's like, to be persecuted in that way. And so much bravery to actually continue to speak out and support peace when you're in the crosshairs like that. And thank you for your service. I will say that what you're asking is quite difficult. Whether it's the military-industrial complex, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed, etc., profiting from these wars, or Hamas actually benefiting in some way from the Gaza blockade, through tax revenues and oppressing people inside Gaza Strip.
And the Iranian Revolutionary Guards benefiting from the state of war.
Yeah, no, I was just I was going through all the different examples where this exists, and the Iranian government has an atrocious human rights record, right? So what I would say is that we can control what we can control. You know, people are going to profit in different ways and, try to exploit. But we have truth on our side here. We need to end U.S. military support. We've been laser focused on the U.S. complicity part, where I've had a lot of Yemenis where like, hey, we actually don't like the Houthis, or like, we think that they're the ones that are. And I said, well, you know what? We have a constitution, and that constitution says that Congress needs to actually authorize if we're going to be in armed conflict. And right now, that's not authorized. Like, I don't want to turn into a dictatorship. I want to make sure that Congress has these conversations. And when we lean on, our own constitution and our own values as Americans to say, Article 1 war authority is very critical, and we are principled about this, and not just support it when it's Trump and then oppose it when it's Biden, as some do. I don't want to name names, speaking of potential allies and enemies and whatnot, but that happens, right? We got to stay principled. We got to say, you know what, there's a humanitarian crisis going on, and we are accountable, to the Yemeni people, because our tax dollars are being used to bomb and starve them. And so that's my center of gravity. As far as the politics with Iran, that's a very difficult situation. We just supported ESCON Res 2. That's a resolution that Menendez has led, commending the bravery of the Iranian protesters. But what I think is strategic about it is that it doesn't close off our ability to lift economic sanctions that are also hurting the Iranian people, and like keeping that space for diplomacy open while we're saying your human rights practices are despicable and they need to change, and also opening up the door to some targeted, like Magnitsky-like sanctions, where we're going after the individual perpetrators of the violence, and not just doing a blanket collective punishment of the entire population. And I think if we stick on those principles, we don't collectively punish people, and that we support U.S. constitutional war authority, we're trending in the right direction and staying principled. But what you're asking is super complex, and I don't know if that, we could write a PhD. I look forward to your book on it, actually.
Great. Thank you. And actually, I want to see it.
I'm sorry, I'll send you the link to some of my work. Thank you so much.
Okay, we can always.
My full name is Mujtaba, by the way, which is a nickname of Imam Hassan. So we have a special relationship, Hassan and Mujtaba.
Shukran, brother.
Now, Chris, did that answer your question? Or should I go ahead with it? And then we'll go to Kyle. I'm going to ask it. Or yes, okay. So this is very connected. How much of the U.S. posture is grounded in our burning resentment against Iran dating from 1979, and how can we counter that? So obviously very connected. Do you have any more to say on that?
Yeah, that clearly has a role. I mean, if you look at the House and Senate floor, you would think that there's a competition for who can be tough and hate Iran the most, or the Iranian government, I should say. I think it's a sad state of affairs. Again, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated this situation, with Iran sending technology to the Russians for their war of aggression on Ukraine, which is horrible. I would kind of step back and ask us to, look at the whole picture, because none of this is happening in isolation. There's a global strategic power competition underway. Part of this is because a lot of the global South are tired of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, broad-based economic sanctions on hundreds of millions of people around the world, and then folks trying to find a different system. And you've got BRICS and, other, formations of these different economies, whether it be China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, et cetera. And, I think the U.S., we really need to take a look in the mirror and look at how we're exacerbating tensions and making things less safe for people and contributing to the climate, which is our greatest threat here. This is what Game of Thrones, you've got all these lords and ladies fighting over territory, but you got the zombie apocalypse up north, and that's what climate change is. So I'm hoping that we can kind of set aside all these issues and kind of come together to solve these bigger challenges. As far as the war in Yemen and our the Iran thing, one update on top of what you said, because I went off a little side tangent there, which I do sometimes. Apologies. You've also got this, pressure by the Israelis to have this anti-Iran infrastructure. Israel has used Iran as their boogeyman to say, hey, don't look at us. Like, we have major existential threats, including...
Sorry, and vice versa. The regime in Iran uses the Netanyahu and other war criminals in Israel exactly the same way that they use the regime in Iran in order to kill democracy. Both of them want to kill democracy.
Yeah, no bueno. And that's exactly it. It's like it's fitting into this narrative that they have about the region. Unfortunately, the people are suffering, and that's why I like to get back to base principles and say, however we feel about this, we've got rules, we've got international law, we've got U.S. law. Why don't we stick to it?
Great, thank you. I'm going to have Kyle go next, and then I have a question in the chat, but you go ahead. There you go.
Assalamu alaikum, Hassan. I'd love to start off with just the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but then I think my inner Jon Stewart would start showing, so we're going to skip ahead. I think Saudi Arabia, when you look to their future, they have a very specific obligation for the Hajj pilgrimage that no other country really has to deal with. That kind of tourist industry, and that the influx of tourists every year, that's how they diversify away from oil, which is why they're building all their infrastructure projects, and which is why the UAE has Palm Jumeirah, stuff like that, to get tourists to go there. And I wonder if that is really why they seek peace in Yemen, is because they realize there's a population in Yemen that would gladly go on Hajj because it is part of, I believe, it's a tenet in Islam. And, we start off every conversation in Arabic with Salam alaikum, peace be with you, and how incredible it would be if we could see a regional organization based on the Arabian Peninsula, built on peace, built on the Hajj, built on continued building of infrastructure, and absolutely a restriction on the sales of US built equipment, if you call it offensive, defensive, that's the State Department to decide. So I guess my question to you is, do you see the Hajj pilgrimage as a soft power mechanism that Saudi Arabia is perhaps playing to their best advantage and the better angels of their nature? Thank you, Hassan.
Good question, Kyle. Thank you for that. And I think I did touch upon this a bit earlier when I was talking about their Vision 2030. Saudi Arabia, they have a plan to rebuild their economy, to diversify off of oil. They're now investing in sports, like PGA Tour, Live Golf / they're trying to invest in different technologies. They are using they just opened up flights. They didn't open up flights anywhere else, but they allowed flights to certain individuals from Sana'a to Jeddah, so folks can actually get to Hajj and that pilgrimage. So it seems like they're moving in that direction. So that's why I was kind of highlighting that it seems really funny that the State Department is pushing all this pessimism, where it seems like they're actually, there's evidence of a willingness by Saudi to kind of move in a different direction. But the seeds of this conflict are right there at the surface. And we could easily see more Saudi airstrikes if we don't resolve some of the underlying issues. So while that might be their posture and their preferred goal, they're not going to risk sabotaging the U.S.-Saudi relationship over it. They have other ambitions, and they're kind of playing China and the U.S. off each other. They feel like they do need to have a relationship with the United States. And we could quickly see this whole situation escalate in Yemen with more Saudi bombings if we don't find a new way to re-engage folks diplomatically and actually start addressing the root causes, which I would say are the civil servant salaries, issues around the ports, and lifting Sana'a airport restrictions and lifting Hodeidah port restrictions. And getting into the weeds of that. Again, I encourage everyone to read that article in The Nation from last week. Absolutely devastating, but really eye-opening.
Thank you, Hassan. Now, we are actually hitting time to wrap up. Maybe, Hassan, you'd be willing to stay after we finish the program and take a few more questions? I'll leave that to you. I know, sorry, I didn't get through all these, but there's just so much to talk about on this. However, we have a commitment to end after an hour, and I'm going to honor that. And I have a bunch of things to tell you and to drop into the chat. First of all, I have an FCNL page about Yemen that you can look at. I don't know, Hassan, if you have other links that you want to put in there. I did get the Nation article in there. Feel free. And we want you to know that New Hampshire Peace Action has tons of programs coming up. You can find them at our website, nhpeaceaction.org. Also, most of our Monday night programs are recorded, and then we have our YouTube channel where you can go check them out. So I put that in the chat as well. This series is free and will remain so, but anytime anyone can donate and support us, we are incredibly grateful. So let me put that in there. That's also nhpeaceaction.org, then /donate. Let me just give you a few highlights because we have a lot of interesting programming coming up. First of all, we have an in-person event on Sunday, August 6th, 5 to 6 p.m. for those of you in the area. It will be a gathering to remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the shore of the Merrimack River at the Everett Arena on Loudon Road in Concord, New Hampshire. Those of you who are local, we would love to see you there. Our next Monday night conversation, July 17 from 7 to 8 on Zoom, will host Jennifer Diebert with the American Friends Service Committee to speak about peace on the Korean Peninsula, what steps we can take to help encourage that. We have a special off Monday night event, August 21st, 7 to 8:30 via Zoom. Medea Benjamin of Code Pink will join us to discuss the war in Ukraine. She's going to talk about the context for the war, the politics in the White House and Congress at the moment, US public opinion, and what we can do to build a broader and more effective peace movement. And then lastly, let me flag for you that Monday, August 28th, 7 to 8 p.m. on Zoom, Will Hopkins will share reflections on 14 years as he transitions out of being our director. So again, we might have a few moments, but let me wrap up here so that you can say, or I should say, visibly indicate your thanks to Hassan. Yay! And we will end the live stream and recording there.